Um, Let me see if anybody is okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
I need to share this with you in your show.
Yeah.
Huh?
Yeah.
Like with team discussion.
All right. So we'll start with our next session, and we have in the next session we have some very interesting and unique way of understanding the problem before us that we are trying to put our hands around it. And my friend and colleague here, Dr. Bill Cipolla, he has unique to him is a unique way of examining and looking at this particular problem. So his topic, loquor ergo est, does saying it make it so?
Before I actually start, I have two things to say. One is, I am reading my paper because I wrote it. And this is an important, when I say I wrote it, I'm invoking the spirit of my favorite teacher, whose name is Jacques Derrida. And you know that there is no such thing as innocent writing or innocent speech, for that matter. So it's important to me that I actually am reading my paper to you. As we know, all speech is already writing, as Derrida taught us. The other thing is that I want my title to resonate with a certain Cartesian, or at least to echo a certain Cartesian theme in Western civilization. Loquor ergo est is, of course, our new cogito. We no longer say je pense donc je suis. This suggests that je parle donc ça existe. In other words, it's the problem of fake news. Listening carefully to Trump over the past 3 years has led many people, including myself, to suspect that a deep change is taking place in the realm of public discourse. Although Trump is certainly not the first head of state to lie publicly in speech after speech, he is possibly the one whose speech has had the greatest impact since it is recorded and shared countless times in the blink of an eye over the electronic networks that blanket the world. A second disruptive act of speech that, seeded by Trump, has now grown into a poisonous vine that creeps around the world, setting down roots in many cities. This is a taxonomic practice. It names certain acts of journalism fake news. And I should tell you that I am interested much more than in the content of fake news or whether or not it's true or false. What I'm interested in is in the act of pointing out something. I'm interested in the taxonomic gesture. Fake news in the world of Trump can refer to an idea, such as the idea that Russian hackers attempted to affect the outcome of the 2016 presidential elections in the United States, and that members of his campaign colluded with them, or the idea that global warming and the disastrous effects it is having on the climate are man-made, or that those fleeing violence and terror in Central America and seeking asylum in the United States are actually violent criminals, terrorists, and rapists. And these uses of the term fake news is the same as saying that the news is not true. Fake news is a judgment about the truth value of the story that it tells. The fake news label has also, however, been affixed by Trump to entire media organizations, as you all know, such as CNN, the New York Times, or the Washington Post, when they report anything critical of his government. Here, Trump is suggesting that these media companies, the newspapers and the television networks, write and broadcast stories that are not true. Since they do so, it is clear that nothing they say can ever be taken for the truth by virtue of the phrase that is common in legal writing, falsus in uno, falsus in omnibus. False in one, false in all. All this talking about truth and falseness, of course, leads me to ask a different question. What does it mean to say that a news story is true or false? In the case of journalistic accounts, the answer seems easy and is available to common sense. A true story is one whose content can be verified by experience, but this bears very close scrutiny. Journalism is, of course, a discourse, and it is essentially a written discourse. Whether it broadcast photojournalism or video, that does not change its status as writing. Those of you familiar with post-structuralist, and particularly deconstructive analyses will recognize that what I am referring to as writing is not the common sense meaning. Rather, I mean writing as écriture. We could say scripture, but that has an unfortunate association in English. Writing as écriture, that is, as a system of signs whose value is established through the differential relations that join each of its units to all of the others in the system. This means that the meaning of a text depends on the interrelation of its constituent parts, not on any intrinsic value. In the written paper, I don't know if you have, my entire paper is in this.
Yeah.
You put it in the thing. Anyway, God only knows why. In looking at the descriptions of truth, what I wanted to say was I have a quotation from Derrida. It's in French, I'm not going to read it. I don't know how many of you would understand it anyway.
Read it.
You want me to read it?
Yeah. Yes.
Nous voudrions plutôt suggérer que la prétendue dérivation de l'écriture, si réelle et si massive qu'elle soit, n'a été possible qu'à une condition, que le langage originel, naturel, etc., n'ait jamais existé, qu'il n'ait jamais été intact, intouché par l'écriture, qu'il ait toujours été lui-même une écriture. So, obviously, Derrida is placing himself in a certain relationship to the relationship between Socrates and Plato. And this is at the root of Derrida's long meditation on blank metaphor or white metaphor that he made, where he theorized the existence of the pharmakon, which actually subtends everything that I say. Back to this. In looking at the descriptions of truth in journalistic manuals, we find some startling definitions. This is journalists talking. First, journalists agree that truth is not a fixed unit. This means that that surprised me. I didn't actually know that. I thought journalists thought that there was a truth. But listen to this. This means at any point in the unfolding of a news story, the truth may be subject to revision. And here's a direct quote. This comes from the Digital Resource Center at Stony Brook University, the Center for News Literacy. In a world where we uncover new information every day and where the changing universe daily reveals itself in new ways, the disciplines of both science and journalism seek functional or pragmatic truth that helps explain the world. Information we can act upon every day. And those facts, or the statement of the truth, can be constantly changing. The way that we define scientific truth bores this fact. That's exactly what it says, okay? That verb bores is not correct in English. I think he probably means manifests, but it's a mistake. Scientific truth is a statement of probability proportional to the evidence. It will change over time as the evidence changes. There is then the idea that the truth, and this is still the quotation, the truth is provisional, which means it may change, unquote. Now this means that what we call truth in the context of journalistic discourse is subject to conditions that evolve over time. Truth, then, is not fixed, immutable value that can be assigned to a text. Presumably, an article written today can contain a truth that is tomorrow revealed as not true. This is something that Mark was pointing out this morning in a completely different context, that changing the date on something could indeed change its truth value without any relationship to its content. Further in the journal commentary, Edward J. Epstein writes that journalists are rarely, if ever, in a position to establish the truth about an issue for themselves, and that they are therefore almost entirely dependent on self-interested sources for the version of reality that they report. And I lift this is very important to me, the version of reality that they report. The version of reality. So there are several versions of reality. Doesn't that mean that there is no such thing as reality? And doesn't that imply also that there is no such thing as truth? And we are saying this in the context of journalism. The version of reality that they report. If there are different versions of the truth in journalism, on what grounds can we make the distinction between fake news and real news? Earlier, we suggested that real news, that is journalistic discourse that passes the truth test, is news that is verified according to experience. This leads us to another Pandora's box. What do we mean when we say experience? Let us not forget, in the context of Derrida's notion of writing, experience constitutes another discourse, a discourse whose reference lies outside of language. Now, we might say that a journalist, an embedded war correspondent, for example, has a primary experience of the story he or she is telling. But, and this is a logical necessity, his reflection on that experience always follows it. What he tells occurs after the fact reported in the tale. The telling of the story, no matter how close to the original event, is thus received as another text, albeit one whose truth value seems particularly high. What this means now is that what distinguishes real news from fake news has to do with its relationship to another text of comparison whose truth value is higher than that of the journalistic text. Do you all follow? Okay. We see this all the time in television news. If we tune into our favorite channel, Fox or NBC, to name two polarizing examples, the rhetorical structure of reporting is exactly the same. Both stations begin a news story by establishing the subject, then at crucial moments, they cut away to live action. The action is happening at the scene where the story is unfolding in real time and space. Now, the cutaway is itself a different journalistic discourse. And we see this clearly in the fact that the cutaway at the scene of the story is itself two other journalists who are on the scene. They are managing the cameras and commenting on what is happening, in quotes, for real. In order to establish the truth in journalism, you simply juxtapose one level of journalistic discourse with another, which is presumably closer to the action reported than the first. Now, you know that being a student of Derrida, I can't leave this alone. I just can't. It scratches me all over. I would like to call this juxtaposition of two different instances of discourse in journalism the truth convention of broadcast journalism. In the same way that, for example, I would speak of a convention in film. To give you an example, in a horror film, an extreme low angle of the vampire suggests his overpowering evil and magnetism and the relative powerlessness of the viewer. Cutting away from the story to a second view, either of the story or of someone who witnessed the story, would thus be invoking the truth convention to establish the piece as real news. What I am saying, therefore, is that the attribution of real to a news story depends on a conventional practice and is therefore subject to analysis in a fixed social context. The members of the social group receiving the news discourse as real all believe unconsciously, as is the case with all conventions, in the convention. In fact, this collective belief is what establishes the convention in the first place. Does anyone want to ask me a question about it? Okay. So far, I'm so used to teaching, you have to so far, we have been considering the status of real news, which we will see is considerably easier to analyze than fake news. As we have said, the test to determine the truth value of news is the comparison of two different discourses. The first we would call the reporting discourse because it depends on the second, which we could call the discourse of experience. Now, the job of the first is to report the content of the second. It would appear then that the first discourse, that of reporting, is derived from the second, that of experience, according to common sense. The event reported must always already have occurred in order for the first to exist. A journalistic account of an experience is always secondary to the experience that it reports. However, when it comes to establishing the truth value of a news report, we see that we cannot perform the test of truth value by starting with what we have called the experience, or what is secondary. We come to this startling conclusion, that in determining the truth value of a news report, we must start with the news report and then compare, in the second phase of our analysis, the original experiential discourse to it. Now, this is a very typical deconstructive strategy. With respect to truth value, then, we must say that the discourse of experience is derived from the discourse reporting it. I'm going to repeat it because this is really radical. With respect to truth value, we must say that the discourse of experience is derived from the discourse that reports it. And this is what constitutes truth value in journalism. What then is there to say about fake news? I think that we can make a few observations at once. First, when dealing with fake news, we find no easy symmetry that would allow us to repeat the operation that led us to establish the truth convention. In fake news, we find that there is no discourse to which the fake discourse could be compared in order to establish its fakeness. If we did attempt to follow the fake news story back through its references, we would come to another startling conclusion, for any comparison with the story being called fake would reveal the truth convention at work. Let us consider, for example, following his inauguration, Trump proudly proclaimed, I love this part, that his inauguration drew the largest crowds in history, far larger. This is so brilliant, please. I want to say, get a grip. Let me go back. I'm starting to teach again. Trump proudly proclaimed that his inauguration drew the largest crowds in history, far larger than those drawn by Barack Obama to Washington. When the news media contradicted him, he launched an attack on the news media, charging them with having created fake news stories designed to diminish the size of his crowds, and therefore his popularity. His press secretary, Sean Spicer, this is complete, you understand that I'm very deliberately emphasizing certain words because I don't want to offend my host institution, but this really is all about his penis. His press secretary, Sean Spicer, was charged with justifying the president's claim. We would assume that such a controversy could immediately be put to rest by comparing the visual evidence, the photographs of the two events. The New York Times published these photographs on the front page the day that they reported this. In other words, we would compare a discourse with a higher truth value with the discourse being questioned. When the photographs showing the two inaugurations were published side by side in the New York Times, it became clear that the claim of fake news leveled against the reports of the media was itself not true. The two photos accompanied the article referenced above. It was then itself fake news. In the grammar of English, two negatives logically equal positive since they cancel out each other's negation. But this is not the case in the world of textual analysis. In fact, we can perform this test on virtually all of Trump's claims of fake news and find that nearly every one of them is a false claim of fake news. This is a judgment not of the truth value of the story being called false, rather it is a judgment of the claim that the story is false. It is a false claim of falseness. Okay? It follows that a true claim of fake news could easily be revealed by applying the test of the truth convention as we defined it above, because in that case, the secondary discourse would be verified in the comparison to the primary discourse. What we can conclude from this discussion then is that there is no possible test for a claim of fake news when it is true fake news. So what exactly is Trump actually doing when he claims that a journalistic report is fake news? Trump's linguistic behavior manifests a curious relationship to linguistic signs that merits further study. And now I'm going to take a look at that. When we speak, each act of language that we utter can be analyzed in different ways. We can, for example, refer to the act of speech itself or to the content of that act. The act of speech can be analyzed itself according to different sets of criteria that have been developed by different scholars. My point of reference here is the linguistics of Roman Jakobson. I don't think anyone has done a better job than he did of describing the different kinds of speech act that exist. What interests us here is not the complexity of speech act theory. Rather, it is the specific use being made by Trump of the modalities that language offers him. J.L. Austin's distinction between the two principal types of speech act can be of help to us here. Austin, following Jakobson, talks about two different types of speech act. Austin divides the speech acts into performatives and constitutives. The latter of the two acts, the constitutive, is used to express or report something that can then be shown to be true or false. If I say, for example, that the sun is shining, the truth value of the statement can easily and immediately be established by looking out the window. Of course, most examples are subtler and far more complex, but what is essential here is that in the constitutive speech act, the reported event can be subjected to the truth test. The other one, though, of these two speech acts is called a performative act. And the performative act constitutes a very different special case in language. Taking issue with the view that all utterances are subject to the truth test, there was a certain movement in philosophy, of post-war philosophy, that established that all utterances could be subjected to a truth test, and Austin said no. So in response to this, Austin explored a category of speech act that he said lies outside the boundaries of truth testing. Here he refers to the category according to which the speaker, rather than reporting something or describing something or stating something, is actually doing something in the act of saying it. In other words, the event reported in the speech act is the actual speech act itself. Austin offers many examples of these utterances. Quote, "I now pronounce you man and wife," unquote, uttered by a priest during a marriage ceremony, performs the act of marrying the man and woman. Quote, "I promise you that I will come," unquote, uttered in good faith by someone who believes that he will fulfill the condition, establishes the fact of the promise. Now, if this person does not in fact show up at the appointed place and at the appointed time, this failure does nothing to change the fact of the promise. In this case, Austin would say that the performative is infelicitous. And if it was revealed that the person performing the marriage ceremony was not a man of the cloth, it would render the performative infelicitous and the people would not be married. Like the performative then, the taxonomical gesture of calling a text fake news is a performance. As in the performative, naming something fake news is a speech act that, as performative, is not itself subject to the truth test. What this means then is that when Trump denounces the media as purveyors of fake news or dismisses the work of the special investigators into Russian meddling as rigged or crooked, his act is a performance. Trump as performer is not a new idea. It has been repeatedly pointed out that many of those who most ardently support Trump would not have known who he is if he had not been if he had not had a television series. For them, Trump is above all else a performer. This means that what they expect from him is a performance. And as all performances, Trump's acts, speech or otherwise, are not subject to the truth tests. They are entertainment. What can it mean, however, to ask whether Trump's performance is felicitous or infelicitous? If, for example, a fake rabbi or a fake priest were to pronounce the wedding vows, the performative would be rendered infelicitous because the conditions of fulfillment would not have been met. Or if I made a promise, I will go there, you can count on me, while knowing that I wouldn't go, then when I don't show up, the performative act is infelicitous. Understand? Because of my intention. When Trump then says that a story is fake news, is it felicitous or infelicitous performative? And this is a very interesting question that so far I think I'm the only person who's ever asked. But anyway, in order to ask this question, we must examine what I call the conditions of fulfillment. By this, I mean that the conditions that must be present in order for the performative act to be fulfilled. In the case of Trump, this would mean, of course, that Trump himself is invested with the power to make the performative felicitous. And that, in fact, is what is happening. Trump, as president of the United States, is invested simply by virtue of the position he holds with enormous discursive authority and power. Those who listen then are predisposed to take what he says seriously. Indeed, the sentence, quote, "I declare war on North Korea," unquote, uttered by the presidents of the United States, can indeed be a felicitous performance, given the proper fulfillment conditions. All speech acts are also directed. That is, they are made by a speaking subject who, saying I, either explicitly or implicitly, directs what follows to a you. When Trump speaks, there are two principal groups of receivers. Two groups of yous who follow Trump. Those who follow Trump and like him, two different groups of receivers. Those who follow Trump and like him, those who do not follow him and do not like him. Those who follow Trump, it has been pointed out many times, follow him no matter what he says and do not themselves place any conditions on their acceptance of his speech. This means that for those who follow Trump, his performance, his performative acts of calling news stories fake news and certain media organizations fake news media are felicitous. Do you understand what I'm saying? For those who like him, the performative act of Trump is a felicitous act. And of course, for those who do not follow him and who do not like him, the same acts are infelicitous. This is not the same as saying that the felicity of a performative act by Trump means that the act expresses the truth. Because his followers do not apply the truth test. They do not compare his discourse to a discourse with a higher truth value. When, on the other hand, the group that does not like Trump receives the same performance, Many of them do indeed perform a truth test because they do compare what he says to a discourse with a higher truth value. In other words, news stories with eyewitness reports, real statistics about crowd size, or the gross national product, or the number of unemployed, or the many false comparisons that Trump makes with his nemesis, Obama. For them, Trump's fake news performative is infelicitous, and they do not believe it because their own implicit truth test has revealed it to have a very low truth value. Here it is important to reiterate a point. When Trump's followers accept the fake news performative, their acceptance does not mean that they believe that what he said is true. This is a very, very important point. The truth has no value for this group. They don't care. It can surprise those of us who have spent our lives in the attempt to describe in one language or another. And I don't mean French, English, Italian, or Polish. What I mean when I say that is the language of chemistry, the language of mathematics, the language of philosophy, the language of critical theory, etc. The language of literature or the language of art. So it surprises those of us who have spent our lives in the attempt to describe in one language or another, in one field or another, the truth, can be startled to discover that for many, the truth is not an important value. When Trump utters that a story is fake news, his followers accept his act as entertainment. Fake news is a part of the politics as entertainment industry. And as Patrick pointed out yesterday, this is an aside, as Patrick pointed out yesterday, in fact, it's kind of pointless to discuss fake news because of this, because it is entertainment. Many will quickly point out that show business has long been a part of the American political scene. Perhaps we could consider the enormous conventions of the major political parties once every 4 years as symbols of this tendency. Those, and of course, famous celebrities perform at these big political shows. Those who attend these conventions expect to be entertained by their leaders. They applaud and cheer as their heroes give speeches that rarely contain more than the same declarations they have already heard over and over again. They are not there for content, they are there for performance. And this is the reason that the performative act is one of the main features of Trump's speech. Many critical observers of American society have pointed to the fact that American culture has become a culture of spectacle. Television has undoubtedly contributed the most to this shift away from a culture of literacy toward a culture of spectacle. Here I'm invoking the recent book by Chris Hedges, which is called Empire of Illusion. Came out in 2011. Commercial television spawned a competition for the best times and the best spots to broadcast a show. Evaluating the size and composition of audiences fell to the Nielsen Media Research Group, and the ratings used to determine the success of a television show came to be called the Nielsen ratings. Since commercial television depends on corporate sponsorship, it follows that the best time slots in the week are reserved for the shows with the highest ratings. This system places enormous pressure on producers of television news to compete successfully with shows whose entertainment potential is natural to their content, such as sitcoms or quiz shows, game shows, reality shows, or those crime scene shows. The conclusion is that the more entertaining a news broadcast, the higher its ratings, and the likelier it is to attract corporate sponsorship. This is what explains the bantering and chatter between impeccably dressed anchors with photogenic smiles and features that resemble those of Hollywood stars. The fact that in a digital culture we are now surrounded by screens, that we carry screens in our pockets, has exacerbated this tendency and forced the shift to a culture where spectacle has a greater value than literacy, with even greater speed and efficiency. When we consider the fact that much of Trump's language activity, where the hell is the next part? occurs on the platform known as Twitter, an online news and social networking platform that allows people to consume and send messages in seconds, it is not surprising that his fake news performatives spread through the population like the fires in California. The population that receives and retweets messages has recently been studied, most notably by Manuel Goyanas at the University Carlos III of Madrid. In his conclusion, Goyanas points out, and he did this study in the United States, Goyanas points out that those who are likeliest to share fake news online are male, have relatively low incomes, are less well-educated, and tend to be politically affiliated, Democrats or Republicans, as opposed to independent voters. This result coincides with the observations gathered at the exit polls following the presidential election in 2016 and published in the Chronicle of Higher Education, that non-college educated men were likeliest to vote for Trump. Although the author points out that race and gender also played important roles, and that the number of college-educated whites who voted for Trump was surprisingly large. However, it is also true that in the past 30 years, the value of a college education in the United States has declined precipitously. This paradoxical question can then be asked, in quote, are college-educated men really educated? Are college-educated men really educated? This was reported in the Washington Post. It's a direct quote. This is 2016. It's appalling. It's really astonishing, said Michael Gorman, president of the American Library Association and a librarian at California State University at Fresno. Only 31% of college graduates can read a complex book and extrapolate from it. That's not saying much for the remainder. While more Americans are graduating from college and more than ever are applying for admission, far fewer are leaving higher education with the skills needed to comprehend routine data, such as reading a table about the relationship between blood pressure and physical activity, according to the federal study conducted by the National Center for Education Statistics. So, a college education clearly does not guarantee that its holder is, in fact, capable of reading complex texts. It is therefore not surprising to find that so many of them exhibit the behavior of the non-college educated group that was identified by Goyanas. If we take everything into consideration, it seems as though Trump's rhetorical flourishes fall into the conditions of a perfect storm. Fewer and fewer American adults are able to read and think critically. Fewer and fewer college graduates are able to make decisions based on subtle arguments, and many have given up any belief in science or in intellectual activity. And economic troubles have pitted groups against one another and strengthened the politics of identity that leads to nationalism and to war. These factors have led the United States to the edge of a precipice where nothing short of the survival of democracy and for reasons of environmental degradation, the world itself is at stake. In the context of public discourse and social realities, it's the words of Marx and Engels that echo in my ears. And I quote from the German ideology, "The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas." In other words, the class, which is the ruling material force of society, is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. The class, which has the means of material production at its disposal, has control at the same time over the means of mental production, so that thereby, generally speaking, the ideas of those who lack the means of mental production are subject to it. Wait. Oh, you want me to end? I'm having such a good time. I have one more, I have a very, very short time. Let me. In a sense then, Trump, whose have I been long, really? This is making it longer. In a sense then, Trump, whose multi-billion-dollar real estate empire places him squarely in the ruling class, is trying to fulfill his mission as one of the owners of the means of production. both mental production and material production, unconsciously, and perhaps for that reason, even more effectively. His use of performative speech acts in his practice of naming texts he doesn't like, fake news, is eloquent testimony to this effort. In the world of Trump and his followers, then, saying it does make it so. Loquor ergo est. I speak, therefore it is.
Questions? Before we move on to the next.
Mark shoots his head.
Yeah, exactly. I have so many questions.
Sure.
So there's something that actually I need to clarify because I recently started learning a bit more about linguistics and I read the Austin paper on
How to do things report.
yes, exactly. And I had a feeling when I was reading the paper, and I think around it also to correct me if I am wrong again, that when he was speaking about performative types of speech, he was putting more responsibility of making the act, the performative act of speech policies or anti-policies on a performer itself. Whereas,
And the social conditions.
yes, exactly. Whereas here in your paper, where you put like more of the Emerson's perspective into that, sort of like put the responsibility for making a performative act of speech solicitors or unsolicitors on people who are receivers of this information.
Well, as you know, each performative act
Exactly.
has two poles.
Mm-hmm.
Most acts of speech can be analyzed from several different points of view. There is no single point of view that ever defines a particular speech act. So in this case, what I'm talking about is the act of, the one who emits the message and the one who receives the message. Now, it is always a question of the receiver, of the conditions surrounding the receiver that determines whether a speech act is felicitous or infelicitous. For example, if I make a promise, okay, and no one believes it, the promise may be infelicitous.
Yes, it
It may be. It's not necessarily so. If someone is christening a ship, for example, and this is, you must know this one, because this is a very interesting example that Austin points out. He says, so you take the bottle of champagne, you hit it. What if it doesn't break? According to Austin, if it doesn't break, the ship doesn't have a name.
Yeah.
Because the person says, I christen you, whatever. That's pretty dilemma. I christen you. But if the champagne bottle doesn't break, the ship doesn't have its name.
Yeah, but it still has sort of like, kind of like, I mean, it's probably, I don't know, I mean, thinking into this way, but I still have a feeling that it is kind of like, for instance, of greasing the sheet and would say the bottle doesn't break, etc., or it breaks or not, still like the responsibility for making the act on a person who performs the act, or I guess, like,
Is your urge to want more personal responsibility on the part of the person speaking? Is that
exactly responsibility? Maybe I'm using the wrong word.
the question of felicity or infelicity of a speech act is determined by an analysis of the social conditions that surround the act, because all language is social activity.
All right, so the act cannot occur in a vacuum.
No, it's impossible.
Okay.
It's meaningless.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a question that can't be asked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay.
Or,
I think quick, don't worry. Your point that 31% of college graduates can't necessarily read or comprehend the text, right? I need to put this in a quantitative context. I think it's so significant. Out of 350 million people in the United States, approximately, we only graduate about 15,000 PhDs in social sciences per year. We graduate about 80,000 in natural sciences.
this is talking about bachelor's.
No, but I mean, just to point something out, right? Of those who have bachelor's degrees, it's about 40% start college, 25% finish with a bachelor's degree, and then 10% have a bachelor's degree, and it's about 1% that have a doctorate. But it's amazing that the numbers are actually that small. That's what's amazing, that those who actually really investigate social sciences, we don't encourage it. We substantially encourage STEM far more. We're far more interested in producing these automatons who are incredibly good in quantification but not very, very deep thinkers about the structure of society itself.
Let me just point out something. The only reason that I even brought that up, but I brought it up because it's something that I think about a great deal. Because I think that it's one of the most egregious flaws in American society now, is to say a college degree when, you know, if you graduate from Stanford, it's not quite the same as graduating from some little community college somewhere. The two things are not equivalent, but they have exactly the same degree. The reason that I pointed this out is that Manuel Goyanes in Madrid was having a hard time understanding why so many people with college degrees voted for Trump, which led me to examine the nature of college degrees. And that's what led me to these statistics, that lots of people have them without having the skill that we associate with them. That was the whole context for that.
Just a thought here, and I don't really know what to do with this except to just express it. So I really appreciate your kind of retroactive move here, where the discourse of reporting retroactively constitutes, in some sense, the discourse of experience. And I thought, what if we took that retroactive enrichment process and ran it through the fake news logic? And it strikes me that one of the obvious points here, but maybe it's not so obvious, is that when Trump calls a news story fake news, he's able to effect a slipping of the referent.
Yeah.
So the news story is referring to an event in reality. Trump calls fake news the news story, and now the new referent is the news story that he calls fake.
That's right.
And then when we come along and say, we got to fact check that, no way, this guy's lying, suddenly his claim of fake news is now the substitute reality event that we are now discussing. And that, I think the major achievement that he makes in claiming fake news, rhetorically speaking, is just to effect a slipping of the referent.
Well, and in fact, the slipping of the referent would suggest that it becomes an infelicitous performative. But I'm not so sure, because you see, the determination of felicity or infelicity does depend on the entire social scene. So those who believe it, no matter what, it's felicitous for them. And it's infelicitous for the rest of us. And this is a very, very rare phenomenon. I don't know whether analytic philosophers have even studied this any more than that. I've never seen something like this before, where an act can be both felicitous and infelicitous, depending on the population that receives it.
These conversations we have to continue somehow.
Okay.
But we haven't known. We need to
I thought you meant
we need to create other platforms to come together and keep talking about this kind of things.
Well, platforms,
How about people?
No, it's smart.
Oh.
Okay, and now we have all the way from University of Macau, China, Angela Chen. And yesterday, the keynote speaker talked about equivocation. And she's kind of picking up that little point in her presentation. Angela?
Good afternoon. I'm Angela Chen from Communication Department at the University of Macau. Like Hong Kong, Macau is a part of China. It's a special administrative region of China. So I'm also affiliated with Lugano University in Switzerland as an external researcher for the past 5 years. And actually, I studied at St. John's University before for my graduate program. So it's a home coming back to me, back to home to me. But please do not ask me how many years ago I studied here, because I'm afraid that will reveal one of my biggest secrets about my age. So I would like to take this opportunity to express my appreciation to the program committee for having me here, and particularly to my mentor teacher, Professor Montero. He has been supportive to me very inspired me from my graduate studies until now. So today I'm really grateful to be here to share one of my research projects. This is about misinformation or equivocal. And I'm afraid I have to use slides, but I will observe the 10 minutes presentation closely, since I only have 8 slides. And so if that's the end of my presentation, after this, I can step down and finish my presentation. Actually, there's only one thing important here from this project. That is online news article in this study for Chinese readers. They employed misinformation that explicitly states the likely cause of the disease. However, the news articles do not always provide information explicitly, but instead merely imply that something or someone might be the cause of an adverse outcome. So therefore, we are trying to use automatic content analysis for the news. And I recall for my dissertation of my doctorate, I also employed content analysis not a long time ago. That's fake, okay? That's a long time ago. And I remember I studied advertising images of Chinese brands in the United States. And it was terrible, horrible experiences. It's labor-intensive work. Everything has to be done manually. And so there are piles of papers and samples on my desk. And I definitely killed a lot of trees in that time. And so it's also very time consuming. So a few years later, there's a computer technology developed. So now we are trying to solve this kind of time consuming paper, not environmental friendly issues. So there are like 3 phases, 3 stages we try to learn and then cope with this kind of automatic content analysis. So for the first stage, the database, we define, we are trying to collect online newspaper data for the past 8 years, since 2010 to 2017. So another project, we are also trying to collect image data. So we are using this customized software that will be e-miner software developed by the ERS in China. Actually, there's a strong research team behind us. And if you have any technical questions or you want to use it for free trial, and they are more than happy to provide you with this. So eventually it goes to the stage 2, and then there's an important step. We try to develop our code book as usually we do for the content analysis, and it also go back to check your research questions. So that will be the most important step for the code book developed. Since I believe I should give this credit to Professor Peter Hughes from Lugano University, and he's the director of Institute of Communication and Health. He originally designed this code book, but after several times of test and revision, eventually we come to the randomly check by our manually for the content. And then we randomly select like 1% of samples for manual check to see there's an intercoder reliability and the validity for this kind of study. And eventually the stage 3 for the output, it's really good. It's the machine kind of help us to do this kind of data analysis and visualize the data. For the measurement of this study, we only selected 4 major newspapers from mainland China, And number one will be People's Daily News. That is a government-owned newspaper nationwide. And those 4 newspapers are highly circulated offline or online newspapers with digital newspaper archives. So it's much easier for the researchers to build the corpus, the data. So eventually, the result for the metabolic diseases news stories, there is about close to 4,000 articles covered metabolic diseases along with the causation, causal inference, and the outcome. So there are actually 15 target words which are required to be mentioned in the newspaper content at least twice. So by doing so, we are going to make sure the news stories are not vague or equivocal, to also ensure the quality of the content. And so the next finding will be about the disease. There's diabetes as number 1 disease illness covered by the newspaper, followed by overweight or obesity. And the remaining 9% is about chronic kidney disease and others. And so overall speaking, the metabolic disease covered over time shows a very clear trend of increasingly attention from the journalists. So it brings me to the next question of what exactly causes of metabolic diseases for Chinese readers. So we are comparing 4 newspapers. So as you can see, the People's Daily News in the left, okay, the right-hand side, obviously it has the least coverage of the causation of metabolic diseases, although it's the newspaper provide direct information of overviews of central government. And the other 3 regional newspapers, instead, they covered extensively on the causation of metabolic diseases. Particularly, number 1, they blame the overconsumption of alcohol as the main causes of metabolic diseases, followed by tobacco, cigarettes, smoking. And so these 2 are individuals framing issues. If they consider this is individuals' responsibility, and the consequences should also contribute to an individual's issues. And however, it's important to note that government policy or the non-individuals issues ranked number 3 for the causes of these newspapers for covering metabolic diseases. So for the consequences of metabolic diseases covered, there are 6 different adverse outcomes. And as you can see, the emphasis has been much more on the causes instead of consequences. So the number 1 consequence seems to be the loss of wealth, and followed by the loss of quality of life, and then the employer cost, and then it comes to the societal cost. So if we take out 2 main causes of metabolic diseases, what else will be left? If I take out tobacco and alcohol, these 2 reasons, and I can find for causal inference on covering metabolic diseases, several terms are closely linked to the disease. For instance, diseases, hospital, diet, hypertension, health, treatment, exercise, etc. So there will be the word cloud shows us So my last slide is about the discussions. Some interesting things to point out. There will be the first, the framing issue. The attempts in framing the risks and outcome of metabolic diseases in the media can potentially affect individuals' attitude. And so, alternatively, media can also omit disease information and risks or remove consequences and solutions from the coverage. If I try to compare with the epidemiological, the medical data for people who are suffering from metabolic diseases, it shows very different consequences and also very different causes proportion. So number three, the study focused on the coverage of metabolic diseases in news media by setting the pathway into a new era of communication sciences. And particularly, we would like to collaborate with engineering people and the computer sciences people for working together. There will be a very good interdisciplinary studies. And we know we do have a lot of funding from computer sciences and engineering, but not that much from social sciences. That's one of the good reasons we wanted to work with you guys. And so there will be the procedure of concurrent data analysis and data collection, and can further employ this kind of qualitative analysis for grounded theory and models. And there will be the second reason after the funding issues for this kind of interesting study. And so eventually that will be the way to contact me by email, and I'm also on ResearchGate. And thank you very much. Thank you.
Any good questions? Clarifications? Comments? Basil?
Probably if you know the difference of the treatment by the photo and the newspaper, why?
Yeah, I will consider that there are editorial policies from also the marketing issues for from the newspapers. The management. I think that plays an important role. The way they are trying to marketing and targeting their target audiences.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And now I would like to invite Anna and Anna.
Hello, good evening almost, I think. How do I escape maybe? Is it touch screen or not?
No.
No. Okay, what's the last? Okay. Oh, I see. Okay. I don't know why Anna doesn't want to come and join me, because Anna is the Polish expert on measuring reflexivity amongst higher education students in Poland, and she's done a lot of research on large samples of students in higher education in Poland. And for today's seminar, we chose just a tiny little sample of her research dedicated to comparative studies of Polish students and students visiting from other countries. And I will start, and maybe Anna will join me in a minute. Okay, so the purpose of this study was to determine the level of reflexive judgment in two groups of students. First group consisted of Erasmus students, and the second one, students who only studied in their own country and never traveled for exchanges abroad. Maybe I'll start with what Erasmus program is. It's a European exchange program where students can spend a year, 6 months, or other amount of time in a chosen university in other European country. And the program covers the differences in the cost of living in that country, our university is participating in this program, and we had many students visiting, so there was an opportunity to ask them to take part in this study. In practice, there is millions of people benefiting from this program, and even some say that it is also has a positive effect on population growth, and that many children were born from this program. I don't know if I'm allowed to say this at this university, but I said no. For me, the most interesting part of Anya's studies is that she actually is checking out the idea that you can actually measure reflexivity, because it's not the same as IQ and it's not the same as critical thinking. So for me, the most interesting was her her progress into finding out how you can actually capture something so difficult to capture, and which tools and methods one can use. And she actually found some tools and methods in America, the largest country in the world, the most powerful, with the most innovative ideas, and also they had the idea first how to measure activity. And Anna tried several methods, and one of the methods she used is a mixed method where you use a qualitative questionnaire, and then you can assess quantitatively, which is quite amazing in its own understanding. But there was this study by King and Kitchener that started using these measuring tools, and Anna has adjusted it, translated it into Polish, and culturally adjusted it and tested it on large samples of Polish students. And I'm coming to the point now how it's connected to this seminar. In the questionnaire, you can use problems that are very difficult to define, and they don't have simple answers, and they have no like binary answers or yes or no, or they're very complex. And in this research by King and Kitchener, they call them ill-structured problems. So here are the examples of well-structured and ill-structured problems. And the ill-structured problems are the problems used to assess students' reflexivity levels. And just a quick recap on what levels of reflexivity people possess at different stages of their cognitive and intellectual development. I'm pleased to share with you that we happen to be on the final stages, 6 or 7. Although King and Kitchener says that stage 7 you only on when you really engaged and very thinking very deeply, and you only happen to be there from time to time. You're not on this level all the time because you don't need it for driving a car or cooking. You can do it routinely. So these are the 7 stages of reflexive judgments that can be measured. Anna was checking whether studying abroad had an impact on different levels of reflexivity amongst Polish students and the students that were participating in international exchanges. And to do so, she used the question of the objectivity of the media. It was just one of the questions, but the one that kind of nicely links to our conference topic. So in this questionnaire of reflective judgment, which is the qualitative tool, the question is asked, and it can be formulated, this is translation from Polish, so it's not perfect. For example, like this: some people believe that news stories represent unbiased, objective reporting of news, events, and so on. Others say that there is no such thing as unbiased, objective reporting, and that even in reporting the facts, the news reporters project their own interpretations onto what they write. So this is the problem question that then the students are meant to comment on, and they are helped by questions, important questions such as: what do you think about the statement? What is this point of view? How does it reflect your point of view? Does it is it possible that people of different views on this subject will have different opinions on this matter? And how is it possible that experts in the field disagree on this matter? And then, depending on profundity of the student answers, you can score the answers over the reflexivity scale and assess whether they're on which stages of reflexivity, on which levels the students answer this question. So this is basically how it goes. And in this initial sample that we will use, if we are invited to run a search for the edited volume, we tested it on 30 students from Poland and 30 who never participated in the exchange program, and 30 students who participated in the exchange program. Maybe we will not go through this because we are out of time. But generally, there were significant differences between the groups. And why is this important? Well, it is important because, as it was said before, we can be easily manipulated. Public opinion can be easily manipulated. And unless we assess the sources from different perspectives, from different point of views, and thinking who's benefiting from this news, who's behind this story, we cannot be sure how the story is told, what impression it's meant to make on us. Is it meant to make us buy into some sort of idea or a concept? So I hope that I'll be able to play a 30-second video to give you an example of why this is really significant in the Polish context. Whilst I'm setting up the video, I'll just tell you that in Poland all universities are public funded universities, state universities, they're sort of funded by the government. There's only about 30% of private universities that you pay for. Higher education in Poland is free normally for students. So it's I suppose different to other countries. Okay, so now onto the video. This is a 30-second clip of a film made by a private enterprise in Poland that was distributed in Polish cinemas straight after the catastrophe that happened in Poland in 2010, which was the fall of the presidential plane, and the crash caused death of all on board and of the plane. So 30 seconds.
Halo? Przerwało? Zacznij jeszcze raz. Wszystko, co ważne, już powiedziałem.
Schodzimy na drugie zajście. Odchodzimy.
To bez wątpienia tragiczny dzień dla wszystkich Polaków i dla państwa polskiego.
So I suppose that's enough. This image, like we were talking about interpretation of images, what impression did it make on you? What was the reason of the catastrophe? Does it tell you what the reason might be in this image? No, not to you. Well, for me, it says clearly there was a blast. Yeah, it's an explosion, fire, and so on. So this is just like some producer who is producing a film about the catastrophe. It's fiction, right? But lots of people feel very sad about the event, and they go to cinema to see what documentary they made about the catastrophe. So this is not implicitly said in the film, but the images throughout suggest there was the explosion. And of course, not everyone went to see it, but they all seen the advert about it. And the population of Poland is divided into two groups. The group that believes into catastrophic theory that there might have been an attack, that there might have been sabotage, and the other half that believes the international experts that led the investigation and established there was a human error. This subject is really close to me because 3 people that I knew personally were on board in this aircraft. That's why I feel confident talking about it because it's not outside of my family matters. I also work closely with the aviation experts who specialize in human factors. And they were very good in interpreting the data that was provided and also the proceedings that were questioned. And I will not comment about facts and how it happened and what happened because you can find it in this book. This is an American author who collected all the data from different expertises and also included the media discourse about what happened. And I personally, I think it's well written. I'm not connected to the author or the publisher, but it's just basically recaps everything that I know about the catastrophe that took place. And now, being very political, I will not tell you I've done this analysis, but maybe you'll be tempted to do this analysis. At the times when the popularity of the group in charge falls in Poland, let's say in polls, somehow stories regarding this crash come up in the media instantly. For example, someone just created some, I don't know, memorial, or they're building a statue in the place that causes controversy. And they bring back this story. And suddenly, polls are rising by 1%, 1.3%. And then again, I haven't done a study, you can do the study if you want. If you did the study, if you may notice that when the polls go down, there is, again, the story comes back to life. There are some, I don't know, special events to do with remembering what happened. And instantly, the party in charge possibly gets a little bit more positive voting from the public. So, in my opinion, there may be a link between feeding this information, bringing back the memories, and the ambiguity about what might have happened, and playing on the emotions, playing on fear, playing on sadness, may or may not help in terms of popularity. So, and this is why assessment of truth of media or how unbiased media are and these sort of questions when we measure students' reflexivity is very important because perhaps they'll be less biased and more critical of what they see and what they hear in the media, and they make their own mind by doing more research into stories like this and trying to see different points of view and different analysis that took place. So this is a little project, and it's just a tiny fracture, as I said, and really it's mostly Annie's work, but I've helped her with this little bit, that included the international students because I teach classes in English, so it was easy to include it in our courses. So we hope to write a paper about this, and I hope that you will be able to share it. Thank you very much.
Any questions? Please.
I have many.
Yes.
Sorry, Anna.
Okay.
The thing that strikes me, I have two questions. There's an easy question and a hard question. The easy question is, it seems like, and I got this insight from what you were saying, that in cases of national tragedy, 9/11, JFK's assassination, the issue of truth does not appear to be as important as the recognition of an ongoing quest for truth.
Yes.
And you see the same thing, that it's not that there is a final truth, it's that there is such a complexity to tragedy.
It's the uniting factor. And also, I think this mystery, like how could it happen that all these important people were together on one flight, and all these little things, like there was an extra person in the cockpit who was distracting the pilots, shouldn't be there. Like there was only one person on board who could speak Russian, whilst the communication with the receiving airport was all in Russian. They didn't have the instruments to land in fog, so they shouldn't even try to make the approach. But the pressure was on because if they had diverted, then they would have to travel in cars, and it would cause delays, and everyone would be annoyed. And there were other human factors, like one of the pilots was actually personally criticized and almost dismissed from duty when he took a decision to not risk the president's life in a landing in Afghanistan, I think, or maybe it was Georgia. I can't remember, but Georgia. Yeah. So when he decided to not do as requested, he was told off and almost lost his job. So he had added pressure to not be criticized again, and there were some other issues such as less training on this type of aircraft due to money-saving measures in Polish military, and the whole decision of even trying to go there in the weather that they've seen. When I speak to commercial pilots, they would say they would never take this risk because it would be illegal in their company. They would lose their jobs. So there were many factors that came together and caused terrible tragedy. But because it was so unlikely, people can hardly believe that this might be just coincidence of many human errors and chain of events. They look for some sort of. Also, we live in the guilt culture in Poland a little bit. Like in the West, you learned to learn from mistakes, and it's not problematic to admit that you made a mistake. It's actually considered a great thing to do, so that others can learn. Whilst in our culture, there's still like we need to find a scapegoat and say he did it, and then it's his fault or her fault, and this causes problems as well, which might have added pressure to pilots as well. Like also the figures of authority. Although we're not as far east of the figures of authority as, let's say, I don't know, maybe China Airlines, or when there's this authority who is higher ranking, you should not challenge them. But I suppose it might be a little bit like that in Polish military still. It's a general, and he's telling me, I won't tell him he's making a mistake because it will look bad. This is my personal opinion. And we still live in this blame culture, which doesn't help in critical situations like this. And also we have this myth of Polish pilots, like they are the best pilots in the world, and they can land anywhere at any weather, and they can fly any kind of aircraft with no training. We have this ethos about which adds pressure on to do things, and perhaps it was true in the past when there were the first aircraft, and it was very much steering by feel, and you were one with the machine. Now it's totally different with all the complex electronics. So, the myth is there, but it's not applicable to current times. So, but you're right, it unites the nation in grief and emotion and fear and looking for who is guilty, and preferably not us, someone outside, And also, I suppose, lots of people like to believe in unlikely stories and conspiracy theories. And again, Facebook is an excellent means, or social media in general, to spread this and to ignite the emotions. And because it's such a tragedy, so many people lost their lives, it's really hard to oppose it, because it's almost disrespectful to talk about it. And things like, saying, oh, it must be the fault of Russians, that's why they're doing the investigation. No, it's the law. Normally, if an airplane crashes somewhere, the country where it crashed has the duty to carry on the investigation. They can invite others. They invited the Polish party to be included. If it happened in Poland, Polish people would like to lead the investigation, but they would probably not have the means, so they would probably invite Americans. So it's not like the Russians are against us, they don't let us do anything. It's just a coincidence that it happened there, and it's a legal necessity that it's investigated by the country where it happened. We have their experts.
Thank you very much.
Wait, you have a question.
Maybe the calling of memories or playing it up again. We also experience it in India. Pakistan is overplayed often. There is also the Gujarat Night being played at us very often. Colonization is being played at us, Christians. So the thing remains figural. The the moment we can't figure out what it is, it remains into that realm of mystery or unfigurable. And maybe Lyotard's ideas about the figurable perhaps may help us to sort of deal with this type of things and the politics of figurable being created.
Thank you. Very good.
Right, thank you so much. And now our final moment here. Yesterday we had in a kind of a global perspective, and I think we're going to end our session just looking at the very local and my colleague here. So they look at local, New York State, the United States, and also looking at coast of St. John's as well.
Michael, I'll be right.
Two of you. Well, I think it'd be easier since we're doing now. Move that over here.
Sure.
Yes. Please, here, just a moment. Okay, give our panelists one chance to come back. Just taking a break. And then start it. So, Angelica, we are recording this, put it on the internet. So please speak loudly and point the microphone that way. And I'll speak loudly enough, it'll come through. I'm a New Yorker. So that won't be a problem. Just wait for him. And here he is.
Excuse me.
All right, so thank you very much for your patience. We were to have Dr. Nicola Trevino as our third member of the panel, but he had to go to an event or a meeting in New York, so he unfortunately could not be on the panel. But I'm pleased to introduce our two panelists for today. To my immediate left, Dennis Hamill is a veteran New York-based journalist and columnist. His work has appeared in the New York Daily News and more recently in the Independent newspaper in East Hampton, New York. Mr. Hamill also teaches journalism at Brooklyn College in Brooklyn, New York. And further to the left is Angelica Acevedo, who is the editor-in-chief of The Torch, and The Torch is the student newspaper of St. John's University. She is also a journalism major, and she will be graduating in May. So please welcome both of our panelists. So I actually want to start by talking about something that Scott brought up. Scott, you're still here. On our first session, really, of his speech, about fractions and Kierkegaard's thinking of people as fractions, as a mass and not individuals. So for each one of you, Angelica, studying and practicing journalism in your role, but Dennis as a veteran, let's start with you. How do you as a journalist approach your stories? Do you do it for the lowest common denominator, which people say approach your story so that everyone can kind of understand it, or do you approach it with a specific audience in
When I
mind?
first came to the New York Daily News, I met a legendary cartoonist named Bill Gallo, who was did a sports cartoon, sports column. And when I came in to write a column after having worked with various publications, I worked at Sports Magazine, LA Herald, Boston Herald, Newsday, and then I was starting at the Daily News, and he said, let me give you some advice. He said, editors are going to come, editors are going to go, publishers will come and go, but if you write for the reader, you'll never go wrong. So when I approach a column, I always imagine, I grew up reading the Daily News, other papers, but the Daily News is the one that my dad used to bring into the paper and read the back to the front because he was a sports fan. And he was a union guy, and he was so interested in stories about work. So when I got there, I took his advice, and whenever I was working on a story, I imagined myself as reading this story at the kitchen table with my Howell sitting there looking at it, finding out what was the news that he could use in the story. And he wanted the facts. He didn't want bullshit. He wanted real reporting, live reporting, quotes from real people. And somebody that was willing to climb to the third floor to get a story and knock on the door, to talk to real live people, and bring that reporting home to the newsroom, and then they would send it to the presses after a very lengthy editorial process. And then the best I could do was, go and tell people what I saw, what I heard, what I thought, what I felt, use all my senses, tell people what stage of the moment was, what color the big guy's socks were, trying to find the telling details to bring a you or their sensibility to the story, so that the reader who can't be there because that reader is driving a bus or helping or is a nurse in an emergency room, they can't be there, but I'm there for them to know, to tell them what it is. So I go out to find out what I would want to know as a reader. And I'm also a screenwriter. As a screenwriter, I think about what kind of a movie would I like to see? And then I imagine myself in the theater looking at the screen while I'm writing the script. So I don't have a specific person in mind, but I have, yes, the city of New York, and what this means to my town.
So Angelica, you might think that you're only focusing on students here at St. John's, and I don't want to put words into your mouth, but is that true? And if not, what is your focus when you look to edit your newspaper?
Yeah, that's basically it, the students. But we do also cater to faculty and administrators and everything, but it's very much what you said too. It's about, I guess, just being simple, putting the facts out there. You can use language, I guess. It's good to use big words once in a while, but for me, as a reader and as an editor, I just want, especially for news, I just want people to know what's going on. I don't really want to flower it up. It's just straightforward what it is, but there are other kinds of means, I guess, to also use language and be flowery. It's like, for example, with the future, we have one of our great writers, Darrell Bogman. He's our news editor, but he used to be a sports editor, and with sports, I guess it's also very different too. Like when you want to do features, you don't have to be so straightforward, I guess. Like you can be fun and you can use different kinds of storytelling techniques, but for the most part, as someone that like focuses on news and things that matter to everyone, like just being very simple, being very, very straightforward, and keeping, to me, the students in mind, like what they will understand. Yeah.
And honestly, I mean, you're just reporting as you need to see. Reporting as I teach my students, shut up. Ask questions that provoke an answer from someone, or give them time to answer. If there's dead end there, leave it there. Don't fill it in with another question. Because a lot of times, as a technique, people are awkward in that moment too, and they start to talk again. They say more things. They tell you things that they didn't really think they were going to. And then you actually just add this press card is a press card. I mean, it is a passport of people's lives. And you have a responsibility to be honest with them. And sometimes you have to say, do you really want to say that? Because the district attorney might read this too, you know what I mean? So, but they tell you unbelievably personal things. And I think you have a certain amount of discretion to discuss with them. Should we really use that? But if you did enough really good information, the reader deserves to know, especially about the story.
One of the topics that has come up has been language. We heard about it today and we heard about it yesterday. Talk about language. Now, Angelica, you mentioned a little bit about different types of techniques of writing. Dennis, you've been writing a lot of different things over the years. But connect, and I want to then start to have you think about how language affects fake news, which we've also chatted about. So how do you consider the language you're going to use for the stories you're going to write? You just spoke very frankly about what your dad did not want to see. You don't have to repeat it, by the way, we're at Charlotte University. But you think about the language and what do you want to convey in that language? And now start to think about how that might influence people thinking that you are being honest, you are not conveying fake news, and how you as journalists approach that in your writing.
Well, you can be inflammatory by using certain words. You can provoke an emotion in people. Especially, I write a newspaper. So you're allowed to have that kind of feedback where you can have an opinion. But I've always written a column based on reporting. Well, about 75% of my columns are involved in reporting, and then I base my opinion on a sort of informed. It's an informed opinion from going, taking a look and listening to people and assessing facts. And I don't like navel-gazing columns where somebody sits in his basement and decides what's going on 16th Street. I mean, they just don't come until they go there and take a look, and that's the job of the reporter. But I could really ramp it up, or amp it up if I want to, and use really insightful kind of language, and have people say things in an irresponsible way, or be irresponsible myself. You can be a kind of literary arsonist if you want, and inflame an issue instead of trying to analyze it to the point where understand it. If you're covering the Brown Heights riots, you're trying not to add to the mayhem. You're trying to understand what's going on there and talk to both sides and why did it reach this point. Talk to people that on both sides. It's hard to do sometimes, but there's a way to do it. That's your job. I think sometimes your job is to try to tone it down a bit and get to the core of it. Why are people going this crazy? When I covered the troubles in Northern Ireland, it was scary going over on the Shankill Road to talk to the Orange Order and the Protestant militants, and then going down to the Falls Road to talk to the IRA guys and the people that were supporting them. But you needed to go to both sides to kind of understand it. What were their beefs? And they ate the same breakfast. They ate sausages and bacon. They watched the same television. They read the same newspapers. They were all Irish, but they hated each other because of their religion and a different form of Christianity. And there was some sectarian hatred that you had to try to get to the root of, and there was a lot of inflammatory reporting. So as a New Yorker going in there to try to understand it, you really needed to speak to both sides and then put it in understandable language for the readers back home to understand. I think that language is very important. You can take something over the top. Doesn't mean
Absolutely, and especially as an editor, I think that's something we grapple with every production night, every week. We read everything, and even when we're writing about big things that happen on campus, like protests and marches and stuff like that, we're very, very careful as to how to bring that to our readers. And even though we think that we might be doing it as responsibly as we can, that isn't always the case with everybody else who reads it. We've heard everything from this is inflammatory, or exactly. Interpretation is also important. So that's why it's important to be very straightforward and use words that aren't inflammatory, and just being respectful and responsible. Because at the same time, you can take into consideration what people might perceive the story to be, but as a reporter, you know what the story is. And you just have to be, I guess, at the end of the day, confident in yourself as well. People.
And you need to rely on editors. You might have an impassioned vision of something, but I always think of my editors as the net underneath. Columnists are not there, might go too far, might be too tough or might be too soft. I mean, and I can tell you how fake news is never something that's planned. Have Donald Trump would have you believe. I'll give you an example of how I would do a story. I would wake up in the morning, drop my kid off at St. Francis Prep, and then by the time I got to the traffic light, I'd be on the phone with Jill Coffey on the assignment desk at the Daily News saying what's cooking. And she'd say, well, here's what's on the date book. And she'd give me a bunch of things. Blasio's doing this, Cuomo's doing that, there's a double murder in East Harlem, there's a socialite killed on Park Avenue. And so we would go through it and then I would pick a topic. And she said, okay, well, who are you going to speak to? I said, well, I'm going to go to the scene, talk to the people involved, as much as I can. But if it was in political, I said, well, I'll call City Hall, but I'll try to call some union people, see if the PBA wants to comment on it, in addition to what Blasio's point of view. So she's telling an opinion columnist that she wants a balanced column, even though it's balanced. Ultimately, I'm going to have my opinion, which is really going to be strong, and I'm not afraid of saying what's on my mind. It still has to have a core of fairness, and so she would do that. Then I would go and I would go straight to the scene, wherever it was. I'd set my GPS, go there. Always had notebooks and take reports in the car, and I would go cover the story and work the story, talk to neighbors, ring doorbells, climb stairs, knock on doors, and talk to neighbors, whatever. Get the story, and then I would be getting my phone would ring. It would be Jill Coffey, the assignment editor. She'd say, "What are you getting?" And so along the way, they're knowing what they're getting, because she's going to go into a news meeting and tell people, all the big editors, here's what Hamill's on. And at the same time, she's telling them what everybody else is doing. It's not just Hamill. They don't, that's one piece of little real estate in the big paper. And then they'd say, so they know. And then if any of them think it isn't worth doing, they say, tell them to switch to something else. But, we're not interested. The editor-in-chief might think it's a nonsense story. That rarely happens, but occasionally it could be, because they might have duplicates. Then I would come back and file it. And then when Jill would read it, she would do a really tough edit of it, and I don't mean a copy of it, but she'd say, make sure that you try him. I said, yeah, how many times did you call? Twice, try him a third time. She was tough, So you want to get the other side to comment to you, she would make you make a third phone call. And you know what? You're using a Daily News phone, so they'll know if you're lying to them. So you're making another call. Not that they really check, but they if they want to, and if there's an investigation, they can. And then you turn your piece in. Jill, she finishes. Then it goes to the copy desk, and they check for grammar and spelling, and make sure the names of the streets are right and the spelling of everything is right. Then if it's a hot button piece, it goes to the managing editor who looks at it to make sure that this thing is worth publication. And if he thinks it's really too hot, he gets the editor-in-chief out of bed if he has to, and motives it over. Then he reads it. And if he thinks it's tough, he sends it to the lawyer. And then it's vetted by legal. So it's gone through about 7 levels of vetting. And it's from the morning from right after I drop my kid at prep, to when my kid's already home, that, there's 7 editors on my story alone. That's one story. So they are paying attention to what's going in the paper, because the reputation of all their jobs are at stake. When I hear people think that an editor would willfully put fake news in a newspaper, it's preposterous. They all have mortgages, they have kids like I do in college, they have loans they have to pay back, they have a life, they have a career, they have a reputation. They're not going to risk it for a Dennis Hamill column. It's preposterous to think that. That's not going to ever happen.
So you described a real life and a legacy, a traditional, reputable news organization, and that's replicated, as I even mentioned yesterday, many journalists.
It's twice as tough at the time.
Okay. But let's talk about now this issue that relates to fake news, especially, which has come up in our conference, and social media. So how do you as the journalist combat somebody taking maybe your story, Angelica, maybe something that you've written, and twisting and turning on social media? How do you as the journalist try not to I'm not saying allow that to happen, you can't control what other people do, but what can you think of as the journalist to be, and Dennis, the journalist who continues to do the veteran work that you've done? How do you combat that? Is it something that you can't control? That may be the answer,
Well-
we're not sure.
Well, the thing is, social media has changed, I think, journalism a lot. And like I said before, people will interpret the story however they want to. So, and because we have social media, everybody can put their ideas out there and stuff. And as a journalist, to me, if that was happening to me, I know that I would first feel really sad and say, what, did I miss something?
Would
But
you
then-
respond on social media?
Yeah, but then I would go back and like, let me triple check my story and everything, and then I would respond. Depending on if it's like an actual real concern or opinion on the topic, I would. If it's not, then I wouldn't. But it has happened before, like people when someone asked me, why didn't I name the spokesperson for the university in one of my articles, and I said I did, because I did. I did it, and I told them specifically in which graph I did. And they were like, oh, I'm like, yes. And that was wonderful, because it's like, and but again, I think a lot of it has to do with media literacy. I think this country is not at the best place it could be when it comes to media literacy. I think it has a lot to do with our president too. But
So what should be done on that? What can we do on media literacy? Offer
we
more
have
courses
to
in
teach,
college?
we have to teach probably even before that.
Okay, so what could be done? What thoughts do you have on?
I think everybody should learn about the news that they're reading. Because it is news that they're reading. They should know what goes into a news piece. They should know the difference between a news piece and an opinion piece and a feature and stuff like that, because they don't. And for me, as an editor of my student newspaper, I always explain, like, I over-explain really when it comes to newspaper and why we do what we do. But it's because I do want people to understand, because it is important, and they do read it, so they do care. So.
Well, in the classes that I teach over at Brooklyn, the first thing I make all kids read is, well, kids, students, all the time. But anyway, I make them read The Elements of Style, which is a terrific book. And, you know, it gives you nuts and bolts of how to use the English language. But a wonderful book that Stephen King, the horror writer, has written about the craft of writing, or on writing, a memoir of the craft, which is a wonderful single volume book on the craft of writing. It's not about writing horror stories, it's about writing English. And I make them read it all. I read both of those. Because I said, you're storytellers. You have to have correct English. You're not even going to get an intern job if you don't write a good letter, okay? If it's grammatically incorrect, NBC is going to say, we don't want this person. So you have to make sure that you write coherent, clear English. And you know, it's funny, because I tell them that the thing that distinguishes you at any newspaper and almost any business that they might go into is the person who can write well. If you write well, you will distinguish yourself. I don't care if it's an inter-office memo. They'll say, wow, she writes a great memo. I mean, I get everything that I need in 2 graphs. She probably could work for Trump then. But, you know, but somebody that writes a really good legal brief is always looked up to by other attorneys. You know, anything that's well written and is thought of in a really prestigious way, and that's going to elevate them automatically. It's going to make them pop out of the pack. I don't want to write well, so I concentrate on how they write the and their reporting skills at the same time. But how it's written is really one of the toughest ways I grade papers.
I think media literacy should be taught
not just to journalists, communication majors, people who want to be in the media, it should be taught to everyone.
Yeah.
Because we're all reading.
If that stat is true, then I heard before that 31% of the college people with PAs can't read.
Can't read a complex book.
So they have some.
complex
Yeah.
argument. There is a university major in Washington, D.C., graduating students with bachelor's degrees who have participated in
We will open it up for questions. I'm gonna ask them one more, get their response, and then please craft your own, and then we'll turn it over to you. You guys can be the reporters now in the interview.
Yeah.
There was a discussion earlier today brought up about the secular and the divine. And it made me think, what are the higher standards? By the way, those of you who are New Yorkers or Americans, you will know that there is actually a food company that talks about answering to a higher authority. It's Hebrew National Hot Dogs. Okay?
But
so
you don't
what
have
is-
to be Jewish.
That's
You
right.
can read
There
it.
you go.
Right.
So he's a true New Yorker. What are the higher standards that journalists need to be thinking of the answering to? That's what struck me when I heard that between the divine and the secular.
Truth. I mean, I think truth is divine in journalism and in life. And we're all flawed. I showed my students a documentary about Ben Bradley the other day, which is called The Newspaper Man. I highly recommend it. It's an HBO film. He's an unbelievably flawed man. Terrible marriages. He wasn't faithful in the girl. But he was a tremendous newspaper editor and had the guts to stand up, storm the Pentagon Papers and all. Kate Graham, she was our woman. And to trust these two young guys who other editors wanted to dump on the Watergate story. He believed in them because he believed they would bring tone and truth. The other thing that doesn't go into, but I know is a fact, is that he knew, Ben Bradley knew who he wrote was very good. And when you know that the number 2 guy at the FBI is giving your 2 young reporters this information, then you're gonna run it. But it took a lot of guts, and he believed in the truth. And he talks about that. He's like, he's not a religious guy. His religion was newspapers, journalism. That's what he believed in. That was his life, and he stuck to it. And on the day that Nixon resigned, he went through the newsroom and told everybody, "Do not gloat." It was a guy that said, "We did the story, solid, and go home with that." I think that thinking about it in spiritual terms is kind of a little for me. I believe in telling me the truth. That's what I expect from someone else. I don't, if they're church going or a great husband or a great wife doesn't quite matter to me as long as they're telling the truth. Same with presidents. I mean,
It didn't necessarily mean it had to be in the divine, but just what was that higher authority?
Yeah, I mean, I
Something
think, I understand that.
Yeah.
I
Angelica?
think fairness, and giving people who aren't usually in the papers or in the spotlight the chance to say their piece and say.
That's great.
And we heard that earlier today too, as you recall, someone mentioned
Shine the light on the cheap seats.
the reports from California focusing so much on the celebrities who lost homes.
Yeah.
So please, I open it up to you. What questions do you have for our panelists about their work in journalism, their studies in journalism, the teaching of journalism? Who would you like to ask
Foreclosures.
them? Yes,
I
that's
want
the
to
change.
thank him very much for very straightforward talk. Yesterday, I heard about the question of the speed of the television and becoming more opinionated.
Yes.
And it's a very great challenge. How do we balance this? What is the way out?
Well, I mean, it depends. You're talking about the cable news stations, right?
Yes, because yesterday he showed us the
Liberals are
news.
watching MSNBC and conservatives are watching Fox. And, it adds to the divided country. But I mean, you know, and I'm guilty of the same thing. I watch them all. I watch Fox too. I've been on Fox. I want to go on the show, you know. So I have no problem because I want to hear what they're saying because it's interesting to me to know what they're saying. I mean, I have conservative friends in the business, and their opinions are valuable to me. And you're silly if you don't. But I think it's a completely different way than I grew up. I grew up, there was only like 3 networks, and the king was with Walter Cronkite. And the one time you saw him break out of the objectivity role and actually offer an opinion was on Vietnam. And it changed and helped end the war because this man with amazing authority and set it up as this is, this war needs to end. I don't know his words, I'm paraphrasing it, but he condemned the war and exposed it for a lot of the lies that went into the prosecution of it. The other guy that did it, I guess, was Morrow, and during the McCarthy hearing. So there's power in these icons on television, which is a very powerful medium, actually speaking. But now that's been diluted, that power, because every night, every hour, there's a new talk show host. I would call them journalists who are out there just spewing opinions. I think they all need to put on a pair of shoes and go out and do some reporting and earn these opinions and things, go talk to people. I think that would help. Now, some of the young women at MSNBC covered this whole Trump campaign from Asheville on both sides, and spent a lot of time crossing the country and did some real shoe-leather reporting. I respect that. Now they have what I call anchoritis. They don't want to have a chair in a studio because it never snows and it never rains and it's never cold. It's too hot there. So, but I think they need to get back out in the street. There's too much opinion. I don't get my opinion. I don't form my opinions by listening to other opinion makers. I form my opinions by reading the news that we're going and reporting on. I just think it's made the country kind of lazy. Well, I agree with MSNBC and I watch Fox. And there's so much of it. I do think, and I'll be honest, I think MSNBC is a little more truthful than Fox. Fox is really like state TV. I think I find it unbelievably, recklessly fake. And stuff on the caravan is racist. I thought they coverage was racist. I think this woman, or Abraham is out racist.
But see, what's interesting there.
Yep. You just said that when you started in journalism, there were 3 stations. Well, that's what it was like too when I was starting out. And they covered the news. Now we have 24/7. Is there really that much more news? Or did we have to create news to make sure they had something to say for 24 hours?
Do you think there's more pedophiles than there used to be? No. We just said we reported 24 hours a day, so that the whole world. We have crime rate in New York City that's down to where it was in the early 60s. Where people are hysterical about putting triple locks on their doors. Well, we have 300 murders. Hey man, during the late 80s, I was covering the crack wars. There were 2,200 murders a year. This is like the suburbs. This is Leave It to Beaver here.
Well, actually, there's a lot less violence. Right?
Yeah,
so we hear a lot more about it, but there is in fact less.
Yes, it's just over-reported.
Well,
24-hour news service.
I just mentioned 2 things. So one is we mentioned Laura Ingraham, and remember, Laura Ingraham is a talk show host. She started out as a radio talk show host. I mentioned this a little bit yesterday. She is not a journalist. And she is, in effect, an entertainer that now has a platform on television to espouse her opinions ultimately. And to the point about the violence, there was a concept in the early 90s, if it bleeds, it leads. And there was actually a television station that had executives in Miami that rose to the top of the ratings, making millions and millions of dollars from simply focusing on violence. And in fact, there's a book written about it where they talked about how the President of the United States came to visit Miami. His visit on whatever issue it was a notable issue for Miami, was 20 minutes into the broadcast because the first 5 or 10 stories were all about someone getting attacked, somebody being arrested, some accident, some disaster, something like that. So it was all about that. Peter, you had a question, please.
Yeah. And Charles, I'd like to know what's the most sensitive story you covered at the Torch? The one that like that night caused you to be a little nervous about waking up the next morning that it was in the paper?
How do we just last semester, the biggest protest that St. John's ever had happened, and it was because students were upset for many, many reasons, but what tipped them over was that fellow classmates of theirs, who were Black women, were getting harassed, by social media and stuff. And even calling on the student that was harassing them was a white female St. John's student. And so that obviously was a huge impact for them, and a lot of the multicultural organizations on campus organized this protest, and a lot of students, it was like over 100, and they marched like they have before, but not so many of them marched to the movement, which is our, I guess where all of the big admins are, and it was a lot, and then they were moved to our little theater so that they could have the floor and they could speak to administrators freely about their grievances that they've experienced here on campus, and it was Black students talking about the things that they've experienced as Black students. And that changed everything. It
Race and social media, boy, that's some mix.
yeah, that's a mix. And so I had a couple of reporters there. At the time, I was just managing editor. And one of our photographers, she was there throughout the march. But then when she went to the little theater, when she followed them all because they moved into the little theater, someone told her to leave. And the student body president at the time said, no, she should stay. She's a part of the independent student newspaper. We worked with him a lot before, so he knew. But then they felt that he asked for her to stay, and they all said no, and they started booing at her, and so she left. And then our two other reporters that we had there, one of them, another one of the Black students who knows a lot of, that's the thing, we all know all of them, so she felt comfortable enough to stay, and she did, and she was going to report on it, she was going to write the story, but she then became a part of the story, like she took the stage too, just to, say that she's sorry and she feels everything that's going on, because, being a journalist is extremely difficult, and sometimes when you relate so much with what's going on, you basically become the story. But that became crazy because we had other students come to and report, and one of them told us that one of the student leaders of the board said that if the Torch reported on it, that they were going to come protest us. And when we heard that, I know that my reaction at first was, what? We've done stories about you guys protesting before, we worked with you, so we didn't take it very seriously. We just thought, oh, it's just everybody talking out of emotion. A lot was happening. That whole little theater event was being live streamed on all social media. So we didn't even have to be there, but we were. And I had another photographer go and take pictures, and they didn't say anything to him. And yeah, but then when we reported on it, I did try to reach out to the ladies that were harassed, who were talking about it freely on social media and on WSB Radio, which is our radio organization on campus. But we were set to have an interview, but then they last minute canceled, which is all right. And we went through with the story anyway. We got to talk to one of the vice presidents here, and he confirmed to us that the student was also not part of the campus anymore, and I was harassing them. And so that was the main story, you know, like this happened. We didn't even put like direct quotations from the students that were talking because we would have to reach out to them, and then we would have to reach out to the separate departments that they were, you know, saying had treated them this way. Also, you know, it wasn't extremely necessary. We also thought that, you know, we were playing safe by not doing that. So we did have the pictures in the paper, and then literally the day after, when the paper came out, just a couple of hours later, on a lot of the multicultural organizations' Instagrams and Twitter and everything was our front page, and it said boycott. You know, it said canceled, and then they said boycott the torch, and that was a lot. We weren't expecting it at all, and it was, you know, the biggest multicultural organizations on campus who were saying this. And yeah, a lot of other things happened, and it was all like uphill, and then it was all like down. But yeah, I mean, we did also get threats directly from students, which was kind of crazy. People that we know, people that we know, we go to class with.
Let me ask you this, as a practicing journalist, did you verify your information?
Yeah.
Did you attribute it properly?
Yeah, they
Did
came
you
to
seek
us.
perspectives on both sides?
Yeah.
Did you verify for the audience, you know, what it was that was fact? And in fact, if I recall, in the following issue, you then also offered an opinion column expressing your editorial. That's an opinion column, and your thoughts about that as it relates to the freedom of the press and how it should stand on campus or extend to your opportunity on campus.
Yeah. We never shied away from it. We addressed it head on, and some people understood and some people didn't. But
all right. Well,
you told it the best version of the truth that you could at the moment. That's what you do.
Well, that was a discussion we actually had earlier too about best version. So that can involve a whole other discussion, a continuing discussion, but I'm told that we're out of time. So thank you both for being here.
Thank our friends here. Yes.
Experience with an exchange.
And thank you very much for being for joining us in this collaboration. And I think I received a lot of emails from colleagues around here. Why don't we do this as an annual feature with communication and philosophy? That is going to be the section of that. So maybe, who knows, where we'll go with this. This is and thank you so much. You are the ones who made it successful with your participation, with your presentations, with being so kind and so generous with your time and everything else. So this conversation has to continue because this is an important conversation in our society, important conversation in our university as well. So then I'm quite hopeful that our collaboration with the Università Cattolica Sacro Cuore in Milan will continue, and I expect it will be a good, productive collaboration. And also, I want to thank Anna for, I'm sorry to pronounce the difficulty with the name of the university, Maria Grzegorska University, and thank for their collaboration, for their partnership, for that they've given us, and given us, in fact, quite a global publicity. And all the way to Macau and other ends of the world. So thank you so much and have a wonderful evening, and please get home to your destination safely. Thank you.
answer. That was a good answer.